Good morning. Thank you for joining us. My name is Miriam Coffey and I'm a workforce supply lead for the NHS in the East of England. Welcome to Future Ready, your transition to employment programme. So Future Ready, and today we're talking about alternative healthcare careers. We know that the job market is highly competitive this year, so we are facilitating a series of webinars to support final year students transition to employment. This includes 3 webinars looking at alternative healthcare careers and ask the questions, where else can your healthcare degree take you? These webinars showcase alternative entry-level careers to traditional NHS and social care roles in which your healthcare qualification is required and highly valued. Today's webinar focuses on careers in the pharmaceutical industry, but we will also have speakers from the NHS Graduate Management Training Scheme and the Royal Armed Forces in July 2026, which will be detailed at the end of today's webinar. So without further ado, I will now introduce Andrew Croydon, who's the Director of Education and Examination Policy and Partnerships at the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It's a delight to be here, and I really hope that today resonates with people. I think it's great that we are asking the question where your qualifications can take you, because there is a world of opportunities out there, both within the NHS, I'm sure, but also those who look to move out of the NHS, and many who might move back in, as I've seen in the past. So I'm here to talk about future-ready careers in the pharmaceutical industry, and let's explore together where that healthcare degree can take you. My name has been introduced, so I'll move on to the next slide and just tell you a little bit about the organisation with which I work. So, as has been introduced, I work for the Association for the British Pharmaceutical Industry, but I shall refer to it as ABPI from here on, just in the interest of time. And we're a trade association, so we're representing that particular industry. So the pharmaceutical industry, as I'm sure you are aware, operates globally, but we are, as an organisation, specifically acting and working with those parts of the industry who work within the UK first and foremost, albeit our members are likely to have a footprint outside of the UK as well. So we exist to make the UK the best place in the world to research, develop and use medicines and vaccines of today and the future. And ultimately everything we are doing is to benefit patients. And so as a trade association, we have members, and our membership is on our website. It's in the public domain, so you're free to go and have a look at that. And you would see many names that you would probably recognise, I suspect. The membership runs from small, medium enterprises right through to large, global, well-known organisations that might be headquartered in the UK, might be headquartered elsewhere, or this might be the European headquarters. It really does vary. So we really are working with companies from very, very small right through to very, very large organisations. But as I say, ultimately everything we're doing is to benefit patients. And the only way we can do that is obviously to work in conjunction with others. So working with the NHS is really important to us, naturally, as is working in partnership with the government as well, because we want to make sure that patients can get those medicines that they need at the end of the day. So on a day-to-day basis, we'll have various teams within our organisation that work across different sectors and areas. And I'll talk a bit more later on about the interface between academia, the NHS and industry. We do see many people who move around that interface. So people will move between one or other of those, in their career journey. But as I mentioned earlier on, sometimes people move back as well. I've seen people move from NHS into industry and move back, and vice versa. So this is all about telling you about the industry so that you can make an informed decision for yourself. It's about you getting the right job, the right job that's for you, bearing in mind your skills. People want to be happy in their job, and that's more likely to happen if you've got the right skills and it's the right job for you. So for some people watching this, you might come away and think, oh, that's definitely worth exploring further, and that's great. And I'll pinpoint to you, where you can find some more information. Some of you might come away and think it's not necessarily for me, and that's fair enough because you're basing that decision on information. And some of you might want to consider it for the future and so on. So there's lots of different options, but the most important thing is that you know where to find that information and that you can make an informed decision about it if it's right for you. Next slide, please. So I definitely won't dwell on this one for very long. And there's animation in this, sorry, you can go through the different points. So who am I? Why am I speaking to you? Well, I am a scientist. I'm a scientist by background. I started out in developmental neuroscience, so my whole career has been in science, but equally in education as well. In my current role at the ABPI, I do a lot of work in terms of outreach, whether that's supporting schools at the school age with STEM education, but as we move through career ladders and up through whether it's university, whether it's through apprenticeships, we do a lot of work with academia and other education providers. So lots of different touch points we have, and that's the experience that I'm bringing to share information with you today. So let's try and put some things into context. Some of you may have some preconceived ideas about the industry. Some of you may have looked into it. For some of you, this may be the first time you're hearing anything about the pharmaceutical industry, other than perhaps being aware that you come into contact with medicines as part of your degrees. So the pharmaceutical industry, and sometimes we will talk about core biopharmaceutical industry. The pharmaceutical industry is the #1 private sector investor in UK research and development. There's plenty of stats and information out there in the public domain about that, and you'll see other science-based sectors and where they fit within that sort of top 5, top 10 investors that cover other sectors. But we are recognised as the #1 private sector investor in R&D, and I think it's fairly obvious, for medicines to evolve and move forward and to develop new ones, research and development is a really important core part of the industry. So if we think about the core biopharmaceutical industry, currently you've got roughly 65,000 people employed in the core biopharmaceutical industry. And again, those roles can be ranging from small, medium enterprises right through to large, well-known organizations. But then when we think about the industry, it doesn't work alone, it works in conjunction with others. So around the outside of the industry, there is what we call service and supply business. And many people with a science background can well end up working in that part of the overall sector as well. So currently there's approximately circa 64,000 people employed in the service and supply part of the overall industry. We do a lot of work in terms of looking at workforce projections, looking at skills requirements, trying to understand how the skills pipeline and the workforce pipeline is changing over time. And we've done some research both with our members and with some other organisations to try and identify how workforce numbers will change over the next 5 to 10 years. And we do have a projection of 145,000 additional jobs to fill by 2035, and that takes into account the fact that obviously there's a percentage of the workforce will be retiring during that time, as well as the additional jobs that will be required because of medicines research and development evolving over time. But when you think about the core biopharmaceutical industry and service and supply, and think about these areas, we actually fit within a broader sector that's referred to as life sciences. So life sciences sector will also include, for example, medical devices as an industry as well. So again, although I'm not here to talk about medical devices, that sits outside of the pharmaceutical industry, again, it might be one that you want to go away and look into, because again, people with a science background, as well as non-science background, will go into that sector as much as they do into the pharmaceutical industry. So again, that may be one you want to look at. But if you include medical devices as well and look at life sciences as a whole, it's about 271,000 jobs in the life sciences sector as a whole at the moment, and it's that's a number that is increasing. So it's certainly worth looking at the different opportunities that are available, and if there's any that match your skill set and any that are right for you. Next slide, thank you. And this one just sort of reinforces what I've been saying about life sciences. The UK does have a global reputation in terms of life sciences, and the current government, have considered it being essential to delivering the DHSC goal of adopting the latest innovations to improve patient experiences in the NHS. So when you're thinking about what you've studied through your degree, and perhaps you went into it initially thinking about working in the NHS, which obviously is a great goal to have, and it's not to say that's going to change, but as you move through your career, you've likely got a very long career ahead of you. People obviously do move around and find other associated jobs that require the skills that they have. And so you'll see how this particular sector dovetails with the NHS, as well as the other interface, which is academia that I've mentioned. So across the academia NHS industry interface, there needs to be lots of collaboration, and where there is good collaboration is where obviously new advances in medicines come to the fore. Next slide, please. So to go into a little bit more detail just about the actual industry itself, because there are lots of misconceptions about the industry, and we know that because we've been doing lots of research ourselves. We've recently done quite a few pieces of research with Gen Z specifically to look at what they think about the industry and what they understand about the industry. And again, when I talked at the start of this webinar about informed choices, this is what it's all about, getting the information out there. So demystifying the industry, dispelling some of those myths, and just making sure you can make an informed choice based on the facts, and you'll soon decide if it's right for you or not. So when we think about the industry, we can divide it up into different sections. There's the research and development side, and I've already started to mention that a little bit. But once those medicines have gone through the various different levels of rigorous testing and finally becoming a medicine that will go to market, there's all the manufacturing and supply side of things as well. So it doesn't have to be that you're necessarily working in a laboratory on research and development, although there are lots of roles in that space, as well as perhaps working on clinical trials, where I suspect quite a few people, coming through with the degrees that you're having, could be an area that you'd be interested in. So there's also manufacturing supply, and then there's the commercial side. So you don't necessarily have to have a science background to end up in the industry. There'll be many people who don't, and I'm not saying all those with a non-science background necessarily end up in the commercial side of things, but some certainly will. So that's another option and one to consider there, as well as various different support functions. And I'm going to go through each of these 4 sections just in a little bit more detail, as well as making sure you have a source of information where you can go and find out more information. So next slide, please. So just a little bit of a deep dive into those different areas then. Now, I've mentioned that we undertake periodic skills gap analyses because jobs don't remain the same. And I know it's the same in any sector, and it'll be the same in the NHS as well. Jobs evolve over time. The role evolves, and that might be because of changes and advances in technology, but it could be for other reasons as well. So different job roles change. So we try and keep on top of that by working with our members, looking at what they're recruiting for, where they're struggling to recruit, so where there are skills gaps, and how those job roles are evolving over time. So if we look at the most sort of recent data that we have, the recent surveys that we've done with our membership and the industry as a whole, we can identify different areas where we struggle to recruit. So if we think about research and development, you might well divide up the different job roles into the different bullet-pointed sections that I've said there. And you could look at that list perhaps, and you might identify with some of those. You might think about some of the topics that you've covered within your degree course and think, oh, well, I did a topic on such and such, and I didn't realise perhaps that it was a whole area of work, and there's opportunities for jobs there. That could be health economics, it could be medical affairs or imaging, whatever it is. Obviously the list is on there, and you'll know where your skill set may match that. This is not an exhaustive list of every job role that exists and every department that exists, but it's giving you some key broad headings that fit within the R&D sphere that hopefully resonate with you, so that you're perhaps prompted to think, perhaps I should go and find out a bit more information about that. So certainly, if you've got a biology or a chemistry background and that's been an area of interest, then obviously there are pure biology and chemists who work in the industry. But obviously, many of them will move around with the industry. I mentioned clinical trials earlier on. Clinical trials or clinical studies is a massive area within any medicine being developed. Medicine takes 10 to 15 years to develop, broadly speaking. And out of the many thousands of initial molecules that might get tested and considered and looked at, realistically, it's really, really minute percentage that actually ever end up being used as a medicine with patients. But as part of that development process, part of medicine's development, naturally, there need to be a number of clinical trials which fit into different phases, depending on who those clinical trials are with, whether they're with healthy individuals, perhaps in the first instances, moving on to trialing in patients in subsequent trials. When people think, when people are perhaps in the NHS, or perhaps you've been sort of going down that route and studying, thinking that you'd be working in the NHS initially, clinical trials is a good area to think about. The only way that we can conduct clinical trials is by working with the NHS. So there will be people who understand both sides of how those clinical trials work, but those clinical trials are fundamental to any part of ultimate medicine's development. So when you're thinking about perhaps skills that you might have or might have developed, that could be an area that you want to look into further, both in terms of the job roles relating to clinical trials from the NHS perspective, as much as job roles relating to clinical trials from the industry perspective. And it's really important that both sides come together for those. And then, of course, we bullet pointed various other different sections. As I say, this is not an exhaustive list. It's a sort of whet your appetite to some of the key areas. And there might well be some on there that perhaps you haven't come across before, in which case I'd recommend you to go and find out more about them. Then, if we've got to the stage of a medicine having been developed, gone through various years and stages of development and trials and so forth, and we've got to the point where that medicine is actually going to be manufactured and needs to be supplied, again, the whole manufacturing and supply is almost a world in itself, because there's lots of job roles that are undertaken there. And again, those are really important job roles. As you can imagine, quality control is a massive thing. But also, in terms of keeping the manufacturing going, engineering, there's a shortfall. I'm not saying there's engineers listening to this, perhaps there are, I don't know, but certainly, our skills gap analysis has identified a shortfall in engineers. And that's perhaps because, the industry isn't necessarily the obvious choice if you've got an engineering degree or engineering qualification. So sometimes you might be surprised about the different job roles that are available, which is why I reinforce the point about, doing some research and finding out for yourself if it's right for you. But yes, there's various different roles within manufacturing and supply that are really valuable and integral to the whole industry working and getting those medicines to patients at the end of the day. Next slide, please. Then if we think about some of the other functions, I mentioned commercial, and I mentioned about coming from a non-scientific background. I mentioned about doing some Gen Z research. This was something that came out of that Gen Z research, the preconception or the idea that the industry is just about putting on a lab coat and working in a laboratory the whole time. Okay, we've seen some R&D roles where you would likely be in a laboratory conducting experiments, but hopefully you can now see, now we'll come on to the third area, that by no means that is the whole of the industry. So there will be people with a science and a non-science background who can end up going into the commercial area, for example. So healthcare communications, if you've obviously gone through a route of studying where you've got a healthcare related degree, you've got a vast amount of information and understanding of healthcare. And when it comes to communicating that with patients, with members of the public, that takes a real specific skill and background knowledge. So again, it might not be one you'd considered, but it's one worth considering if you have those skills and that's of interest. And of course, there's other areas around that as well. You'll all be aware, I'm sure, that there is always medical information that comes with any medicine, and there's a variety of different job roles that fall under the subheading of medical information, some of which you might be moving into shortly after entry into the industry. Others you might be working your way up or gaining further qualifications once you're in industry. And there's sales and marketing. So again, there's a few broad headings there for commercial, but sitting under those again are a number of different job roles. And then finally, the support functions, which are very easy to overlook, I would say, I suppose. But again, there's still another important cog in turning the wheels of how the industry operates. So as with any industry, with any business, there's a need for a finance department, there's a need for a human resources department, recruiting people and so on, and there's information technology and training development. I would imagine you've come across some of those functions anyway in your conversations and with the NHS, and you've looked at how the NHS operates. So you might be familiar with some of those terms. And actually, it's no different in the pharmaceutical industry as it is no different in many other sectors. So again, those functions are important and play a vital role. And when we think about that goal of benefiting patients at the end of the day, even if you're not necessarily patient facing, perhaps, or not necessarily at the bench in the laboratory, your role in these other functions is still equally important and has a part to play in benefiting patients, whether that's in the UK or anywhere else in the world for that matter. So it's worth bearing that in mind as you do your research and you think about what it is you might want to do if you were to consider this industry as a place to develop your career. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what are the skill requirements? Inevitably, I think like many sectors, skill requirements change over time. We conduct skills gap analyses periodically, and if we go back to the skills gap analysis of 10 years ago, the outcome and findings of that will be very different to our most recent one. So it is evolving. It's a very innovation-based industry, so it does change. And obviously where there is new technology to adopt, it would be adopted with caution, but at the same time, if it is beneficial, it's going to be adopted. So I think you can probably see that from those first few bullet points. Digital and data skills are really important and are proving increasingly so. Likewise, you can't really go to any sort of job-based webinar or activity these days without hearing about AI. That doesn't mean to say that it's being adopted for everything, but with caution, it can be tested and so on, and there are areas where that will be incorporated into operations. So it's inevitable in many sectors, I feel, that an element of AI will come into thinking about how that features within your career path. So digital and data skills are significant priorities. If we think about our most recent skills gap analysis, that came out as a really important area. And we can talk a bit more about that later on as well, but that's one to consider. And then, we also think when we do skills gap analysis, we also think about what are the other challenges that are ahead that might be facing the industry. I've talked about the number of jobs it's estimated to be filled by 2035 and how that number is changing. And some of that will be through retirement, and some of that will be through what we call churn, so people moving around. Also, the fact that there are great opportunities within the industry, and it does value diverse perspectives. Diverse workforce brings diversity of thought, and that's really important to what we do. But again, that's one for you to look into and how that matches, what your interests are and where your passions lie. And then obviously, as I mentioned, an innovation-based industry, as we are, it's about keeping pace with that. So once you're in the industry, there's certainly lots of training available that help you, keep up with new advances, as well as those who enter the industry with the new skills that match those different new advances. Next slide, please. So how do you access these fulfilling careers? Well, there's different routes into the industry. I appreciate this particular webinar is obviously for those who've been working on their healthcare degrees, but if you enter the industry, you'll just as soon come across people who've gone through the apprenticeship route as well. So both routes are equally valid and important to the industry, and both routes can lead to fulfilling careers. When we did our recent skills gap analysis, and when we looked at people entering the industry from those different routes, we considered where are the skills where have we struggled to recruit. And in the past, certainly some of the areas where we struggled to recruit have ended up in conversations and have ended up in new apprenticeship standards being developed, such as previously in bioinformatics, for example. So these next few bullet points point out just a bit of a further deeper dive really into some of those skill areas where certainly over the last few years the industry has struggled to recruit. And that can be for a number of different reasons, but certainly you may well look at that list and identify things there that, oh, that was part of one of the units that I studied, was quite interested in that, so maybe it's worth considering further to look into that. Next slide, please. So in terms of just a little bit more about the traditional university route, and I think most of the people watching this are probably likely coming towards the end of their degree course. However, the industry itself does have lots of links with academia, and it's obviously seen as important as trying to offer experience to individuals. And certainly there's a good history of providing placements for those who've gone through sandwich degree courses, but of course that's not possible for everybody. And so, if you haven't gone through that, there are other opportunities available too. And for example, if you have graduated, not all companies, but there are certainly companies who do offer graduate training schemes. And within those graduate training schemes, you are taken on, and for example, through the first 24 months, you'll be circulating through placements in different parts of the organisation, different parts of the industry, much like some of the departments and areas I've already covered in the earlier slides, so that you get a feel for how they all operate together before you actually move into the role that you're looking to take on. Next slide, please. And then apprenticeships. And again, as I mentioned, perhaps this is less of a route for you because of where you are currently and the path you've taken so far. But if you join the industry, you will find that there are people who have worked their way up through apprenticeships. And so this just gives you a flavour for where you might encounter those, because as you can see from this, apprenticeships are offered from level 2 upwards. And these numbers are changing, but we're keeping a track of them. And across those different levels, as you'll also see from this slide, that they're being delivered across many different areas. So whilst manufacturing and research and development are really popular areas, as you'll see, people will be working their way up through the apprenticeship route in many other different parts of the organisation, whether that's in communications, procurement, IT and finance. So again, gives you a good feel for how people are entering the industry and how that matches with your route into industry. So if you get into the industry, you'll be working alongside other graduates as well as those who've come through the apprenticeship route. Both routes are really valid, really important to us, and both routes lead to fulfilling careers. Next slide, thank you. So what do we know? What do we know so far? Well, I've mentioned the fact we do skills gap analyses, we do work with Gen Z. We know from some of that work in terms of getting a bit of an understanding of how Gen Z view and other generational workers view the industry. It is seen as a critical part of building the pipeline for us, having access to that particular generational skills. Young people have positive perceptions of the industry on the whole, is what we're finding, and an understanding that the industry can have a positive impact on the UK. The jobs, again, our survey shows that the jobs that we're offering are driving young people's career choices. So many of them are seen as being favourable, and the fact that they are attractive to people from a range of different backgrounds. Perhaps majority are from STEM backgrounds, but as I've mentioned a few times, you can be coming from a non-STEM background, science, technology, engineering, and maths, and still, it can still lead to a fulfilling career in the industry. The survey that we did with Gen Z, it was found that on the whole, the jobs are considered to offer a positive work-life balance. I know that's important to Gen Z as a consideration when you're thinking about all the different factors that come into determining where you might choose to apply or where you want to pursue your career. And there is a lack of awareness about the diversity of roles. So I've mentioned diversity already. It's important to us and it brings diversity of thought. But obviously that's an area where we need to continue working to get that message out there, because generally speaking, from the perception of those that we've been doing surveys with, there was a lack of awareness about that. And also a bit of a myth we need to bust is about the industry being perceived as being relatively narrow academic pathway to entry. And hopefully the slide I showed that shows that people from traditional academic route and apprenticeship route are equally valued and will end up with fulfilling careers. So they're both important. So again, that's another myth that we need to bust, and perhaps something that you didn't necessarily know. So I've talked quite a bit in terms of giving you various different bits of information and different snippets that may have whetted your appetite a little bit. But from my perspective, obviously can't cover absolutely everything in this webinar. And for me, it's all about you doing your homework and directing you to where you can do your homework and find out for yourself and explore as much as you want to if something has sort of sparked interest. So the ABPI, as I mentioned, is a trade association, and we have our own website, abpi.org.uk. There is a QR code coming up later on, which you can scan, which takes you directly to these career pages that you're seeing. So there's some snippets here from the careers pages, and a couple of areas of those careers pages which you are free to explore as much as possible and as much as you want to. A couple of areas which are really important and valuable, and we get lots of positive feedback on, are the pharmaceutical recruiters page and the job case studies page. So with the recruiters page, we've effectively done a lot of the legwork for you, because there's lots of companies within that recruiters page that you may not necessarily have come across before. You may not have heard of them, and that's not a criticism, it's just a fact. There'll be some well-known names, but there'll be some that perhaps you wouldn't have heard of, or might not necessarily come up on a search of pharmaceutical companies. If you type that into the search engine, it's not going to list everything. Whereas we have drawn together the recruitment pages from all of the ABPI membership. So within a couple of clicks, you can access about 70 plus different company recruitment pages. You can find out what they're recruiting for at the moment. You can find out the sort of salaries that are available with that. You can find out where they are geographically. Some of you will be happy to move and some of you won't want to relocate. So that may or may not be necessary. So you can actually filter by geographical location if you want, as well as filtering by area of interest. I'm sure that you've all got your respective areas of interest that you have, particularly passionate about. So maybe finding a company that's researching in that particular disease area unit is something that's of interest to you. So again, you can filter on this page, and because we've collated them all together, it's only really taking you a couple of clicks to find out information from all those 70 plus different companies, which is a wealth of information. So I would encourage you to go to that particular page and have a look at that. And the other one, which I think you'd find valuable, because we certainly get lots of positive feedback on it, is the case studies page, where you get to hear from real life people. They're not avatars, they're not made up. These are real life people in real life jobs who've set aside a couple of minutes to just record a little piece to camera for us about the job that they do, how they got into it, why they like it, what they do on a day-to-day basis. So rather than just listening to me, you're hearing it from people who are doing those jobs on the ground. And again, you can get a feel for, perhaps that's one that might appeal to me. It's worth finding out more about it. So there's a video case studies. There's lots of video case studies on there, as well as written case studies as well. So I'd encourage you to go and have a look at those and to find out a bit more information about those different job roles that are available. And then on my next slide, I've just pulled out one of those case studies. So this is Rosemary, who started out as a nurse, and she's an example of someone who has moved into the industry for a job role. But as I say, my experiences between industry, academia, and NHS, there can often be quite a bit of movement, and sometimes it's movement backwards and forwards, and sometimes it's just movement from one to the other, because within that interface, there are lots of transferable skills that are applicable to all those three areas, and it's really important those three areas collaborate and work together, because the different medical advances that have been really benefit from those different collaborations. That's why that's important. But you'll find more case studies like this on the case studies page that you can obviously go and have a look at in your own time. Next slide, please. So the QR code is on the next slide, but this slide is just a little bit of a reminder where you can find out more. You can either go on the ABPI website /careers. You can visit those different pages that will provide you with more information. And I'm hoping that at the very least will help you make an informed career decision. Whether the industry is right for you or not, only you will know, but at least make that decision based on the information that's available, because there definitely are, and hopefully you've seen that from what I've mentioned today, there are definitely lots of opportunities within the industry for fulfilling careers, and I'm sure you'll have transferable skills that you can transfer across that interface. So I'll leave you with the QR code on the next slide that you can scan, takes you to that. And at this point, I'm happy to take any questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Fantastic presentation. There were lots of information and really interesting facts, really displaying the diversity, I think, of different roles available within the industry. So we've recorded this webinar on behalf of healthcare students who will be qualifying this year. And we've had some questions submitted that we'd actually like to pose to you. So I'm going to ask my colleague Nicole to ask those questions, and then hopefully you can provide some answers.
Great, thanks, Miriam. Yeah, so the first question that's come in, Andrew, is for students who might not have access to placements or any networks within the industry, how can they translate their NHS experience into industry relevant experience? And what are the best examples of sort of achievements and behaviours that you'd expect to see on a CV or an interview?
Yeah, that's a really good question. not least because, it's not realistic that every student can have secured a placement, whether that's with a well-known company or a small company. That is not realistic, and the industry is fully aware of that. The industry, to be fair, is inundated with applications for placements, and whilst there are lots of placements, and I've shown a graph of that, the companies have an application process for those placements to try and make it as fair as possible, but realistically there is only a certain number. So when it comes to applying for a job, the industry is not expecting every CV that comes in front of them to say that they've had this wonderful year-long placement with such and such a company. That's not realistic. They do expect, okay, well then let's look at what else there is. So if you have had experience, then that's great, and I'm sure that will inform your thinking. But if you haven't, there's various other different ways of showcasing the skills that you have and how they're applicable and the passion that you have. And one of the things I would focus on here is, if you're coming from a healthcare background, hopefully during the course of the presentation, I made it fairly clear there's a lot of collaboration between, even if we just put academia on the side for 1 minute, if we just take two parts of that interface, NHS and the industry, there is a lot of collaboration between NHS and industry. And, take clinical trials, for example. There's several phases of clinical trials. So there are several phases where existing NHS staff will get involved in those clinical trials and will be collaborating and working with industry. So where you've come through perhaps an NHS route, let's say, or else, that's where you've been receiving your training, you already have a really good insight of how that works on your side. And that can be really valuable experience and something really valuable to talk about when you then think about, actually, I could be working from the other side here, but I've got the experience of knowing how it works on both sides. So having that experience obviously helps, that collaboration to be even more effective, because both sides can be working in synergy and not without having to come across, well, this is how we do things here and this is how we do things here. There can be that mutual respect that obviously things in industry and NHS will work differently, but actually I can appreciate the other side of how that works. So this is the solution we're going to use to move this clinical trial forward, because that's in everyone's interest. And we want to make sure, if this is a valuable, important medicine, that we can get it to market. So I would say that's definitely an area to think about, when you're putting that together, having the respect and understanding of the values and ethics and behaviours on one side, and an operational piece as well, just from a day-to-day perspective, and how that can marry up to enable a successful collaboration.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Really comprehensive answer. The second question, just moving slightly away from experience and onto skills, is as so many of the people watching this are going to be students at the moment, as students in the NHS, how can we best demonstrate transferable skills? So things like patient safety, communication, decision making when applying for those roles. So if you're applying for a role in medical affairs, for example, how could we demonstrate the transferable skills that we have?
So again, it's not always about the fact, oh, I've had some brilliant placement where I happen to put all these things into practice. And if you have, of course, that's great and really valuable. But again, it's about, as employers, being realistic that not everybody will have had those same chances and opportunities. However, if you've gone through a degree process, then inevitably, there'll be a number of different activities, whether that's individual or whether that's group activities, that will have drawn in some of those areas where you're considering about patient safety, whether it's how you're communicating, and all those parts, all those skills are, to be fair, relevant to a number of different sectors and job areas. So it can be drawing out examples of what you've done. I worked on this particular project where we perhaps hypothetically looked at such and such, and one of the key things we were doing was, it required an understanding of patient safety, and then sort of making that point that you understand that's one that's just as important in the industry as it is in the NHS.
Lovely. Thanks, Andrew. I'm just going to ask the last question before we wrap things up. I think people watching the webinar will have learned an awful lot from your presentation. And if they're tempted to start looking for roles, are there any entry-level roles, so ideal for people who are just kind of finishing their university course, that spring to mind in terms of where there might be entry-level openings? And if there are, what would make an application stand out to you in those areas?
Yes, very good point, because you want to get your foot on the ladder, don't you? And then obviously you're working way up. And I do know that companies across the industry are going through a process at the moment where perhaps historically some, they often job adverts, if you've looked at them, might say a particular qualification that's required, and that might be a degree, it might be a further qualification even. But I do know that the industry are going through, when they re-recruit, or they're recruiting for a particular job role, they're carrying out a sense check exercise. Does this actually require a degree, or does this actually require a degree in this specific subject? So the first point I'm making is that when you look at those job adverts, hopefully you can be rest assured that actually it's asking for what they consider to be relevant, and that in itself is giving you an idea. Okay, this is looking like it's an entry-level role. There's also the point which I mentioned earlier on about the fact that some, certainly not all, but some companies do offer graduate training schemes. So as you are as you are graduating, think about that and the different timescales for those, and whether you can get onto those. Again, competition will be high. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. It's normal to have more applications for the graduate training schemes than there are places available. But hopefully you'll have your opportunity to shine, and the right people with the right skills and so forth will get those particular job roles. So that's another one to consider. Or else, if you're thinking about ones that perhaps you don't get onto either of those different areas, there will be entry-level roles in all those different areas of work. So where we mentioned research and development, manufacturing and supply, within and commercial and so forth, within those different groups, there will be entry-level roles. Sometimes it's just about finding it, because it will vary from company to company. If you're working in a small, medium enterprise, the nature of working in a small organization is you usually wear quite a few hats. Okay, and you're drawing on different skills for quite a few hats, but you're actually working on a small number of projects. The flip side, where you're working in a very large organization, and both ends of the scale suit some people and not others. In a very large organization, the chances are the organization's got multiple sites. It could have several thousand employees, and you won't certainly necessarily come across all of them, but you might be working in a very, very detailed way in quite a very specific area of the operation. So there will be, across both those different areas, there'll be research and development roles, which are entry level. There'll be manufacturing side roles, which are entry level. So some of that's about doing your homework and looking at different adverts and seeing where they are, but they will exist. But you also need to consider, do I want to work in a very large organization, or do I want to work in a small organization? But in terms of specific job roles, the title may differ. So there's no point in me necessarily saying, oh, well, such and such a role, because the title given to that in a small, medium enterprise will be different, because you might be doing multiple things, as opposed to the title of that job role, same job role, but just put into practice slightly different. The title is going to be different in a large organization. But the first and foremost, think about the different area that you want to work in, and then start whittling it down.
Brilliant. That's great advice. Thank you very much. I'll hand back to Miriam.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you, Andrew. So all that leaves for me to do is to actually say thank you again to Andrew, who is the Director of Education and Examination Policy and Partnerships at the ABPI. You've given us a fantastic oversight of careers in the industry, which I think will be incredibly useful for our qualifying students this year. So thank you again, Andrew. Please join us for 2 other Future Ready events. The first, NHS Graduate Management Training Scheme, on the 7th of July at 12 until 1, and the second, Armed Forces Nursing and AHP Careers, on the 28th of July, also at 12 until 1. Finally, please do fill in this webinar evaluation. Let us know what you thought of today's webinar and what we could do in the future. Once again, thank you so much for joining us.